My name is Ruth Peterson, and I live in the Boisfort Valley outside of Chehalis. And as I thought about how to introduce myself, I wanted to think of a phrase that described my life. And I came up with a phrase, a life full of learning. Many years ago, when I graduated from high school, my father, who is a Boeing executive, got me a job at Boeing Computer Services. My job was hauling 50-pound boxes of paper from a pallet to a printer and back again, all night. It was a very glamorous job. I was one of two women in a shop that was mostly male. But Boeing provided classes for their employees, and I was able to take a programming class in COBOL. At that time, it was the dark ages of computers. The computers were about the size of this room, and when we wrote programs, we key punched them on a machine, and they came out on little manila cards. That's when I started to learn about computers, and for the next few years, I was a computer programmer. I learned about databases. I even taught some classes for Boeing around the country. Years later, I met a wonderful guy. He's a fireman. His name is Greg. A lot of you know him. And when children came along, I left the Boeing company to become a full-time mom. Since I love learning, it was kind of a natural idea for us to homeschool. So I homeschooled my children, and for the first time in my life, I learned the rules of grammar. I learned phonics. We scooped tadpoles out of the ditch, and we learned about science. The one thing I didn't do, I refused to dissect cow eyeballs and that kind of thing, but I had friends who really loved to do that kind of thing, so I was off the hook for that. During that time, some friends and I formed a group called Lola, or Ladies of the Lost Arts, and one month we learned how to make soap. Another month we learned how to make cheese. We made cow cheese and goat cheese. We made hand creams out of herbs. We learned how to sew. We learned how to quilt. And while it seems kind of silly, it was a lot of fun, and we did learn a lot. One of the most formative events that happened during my homeschooling years was 2.5 years ago when our valley experienced a devastating flood. The Boisfort Valley had many homes that were destroyed, and while our home was not destroyed, we ended up helping with flood recovery at that time, and I ended up working with a lot of agencies. I worked with the building department, I worked with FEMA, I worked with the Small Business Administration, mainly because my friends and neighbors were busy mucking out their houses. They were ripping out sheetrock. They didn't have time to figure out all the paperwork that FEMA and the Small Business Administration and the building department needed to have for them to continue their work. So I helped with the volunteer coordination. So I learned a lot doing that, but I also learned a lot about communities. And a community can come together and help each other rebuild to become one again after this devastating flood. It was a terrible time in that it was a flood and many people were devastated, but it was a wonderful time because it really made our community much stronger in the end. Then last year, my youngest son went to Running Start. That meant I was no longer a homeschooling mom. I had no kids left to teach. I thought, what am I going to do for the rest of my life? And I have always been interested in politics, so when a friend of mine offered me a position up at the legislature in Olympia, I thought, well, I think that sounds like a very interesting thing to do. So this past January, for 3 months, I was a legislative aide for Senator Val Stevens. And I experienced my second flood. It was a flood of information. I had so much information coming in, and it was almost overwhelming, but I loved learning. I loved learning about the bills. I studied policy. I learned about the legislative process, and I met a lot of people and learned a lot about them. But politics involves a lot of speaking. I had to talk to people I did not know. I had to talk to small groups and large groups. I sometimes had to talk to people about the issues that I really was not prepared to speak on. I sometimes had to speak to people who were a little antagonistic about the opinion that I was conveying, because I'm speaking for my senator, and my senator is very, very conservative. And it was a very difficult part of my job. I was very nervous. I would get tongue-tied. I would forget what I was trying to say. And to this day, I still am extremely nervous every time I have to speak. So, coming from a life full of learning, I am determined that with Toastmasters, I will learn how to speak. I will learn how to speak well, and I will do it without being so terribly nervous. Madam Toastmaster.
Thank you.